The morning sun had just begun to peek over the Atlanta skyline at 6:30 a.m. when the alarm above the bed began to buzz. Sarah Collins wouldn't have to be in court until 9 o'clock, but nearly a decade as a federal prosecutor had ingrained preparation into her daily routine. Her small but classy apartment in downtown Atlanta reflected her nature of organization, with case files neatly stacked on her home office desk and her court attire always laid out the night before. Today was different, though. Sarah wasn't going to the federal courthouse where she normally commanded respect as an assistant United States attorney. Today, she needed to deal with a simple personal matter at the municipal court, a disputed parking ticket that she thought had been issued in error. She dressed more casually for this eventuality, with a neat navy blue blazer over a white blouse and black pants. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror, Sarah carefully pinned back her natural hair, which she had recently started wearing proudly after years of straightening it. At 35, her face showed the determination that had helped her graduate at the top of her class from Howard Law School and secure her prestigious position at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Just a quick court appearance, she told herself, grabbing a banana and her travel mug filled with fresh coffee. Her Mercedes-A recent reward for winning a big corruption case waited in the parking garage. It was her baby, though she often noticed surprise from passers-by when a young black woman stepped out of such an expensive car. The morning traffic inched its way through downtown Atlanta, but Sarah wasn't concerned. She had left herself plenty of time to make the 9 a.m. appearance. She turned on NPR, listened to the morning news, and mentally reviewed her documentation for the parking ticket dispute. The ticket had been issued in a spot where the parking signs were contradictory, and she had photographs to prove it. At 8:15 a.m., her car's Bluetooth system announced an incoming call. The display showed it was from her boss, the U.S. Attorney himself. Sarah's heart rate quickened. A direct call from him usually meant something urgent. "Sarah, I'm sorry to call so early," her boss voice came through the speakers. "We've got a situation with the Thompson trafficking case. The defense just filed a last-minute motion that could blow our whole prosecution. I need your eyes on this right now." Sarah squeezed her steering wheel a little tighter. The Thompson case was one of the biggest human trafficking cases in Georgia's history. "Of course, sir. What's the timeline?" "The judge has given us until noon to respond. Right now, I'm sending the documents to your email. Can you review them and give me a call back with your analysis?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied professionally, her mind already racing. She had planned to arrive and park at 8:30 a.m., giving herself plenty of time to find the right courtroom. Now, she would need to find somewhere to pull over and review these urgent documents. Then, Sarah was able to find a spot in a small coffee shop parking lot. She pulled out her laptop, connected it to her phone's hotspot, and began reviewing the defense's motion. The legal arguments were complex, and she found herself taking detailed notes. Time ticked by as she analyzed each point, determined to provide thorough feedback. When she finally looked at her watch, her heart sank. It was 8:50 a.m. The municipal court was still 10 minutes away, and she knew finding parking would take time. She immediately called her boss back, discussed her findings, and promised a more detailed review after her court appearance. Back in traffic, she did her best to stay patient. She had never been late to court in her life. Ran so contrary to everything she was about. She also knew her job as a federal prosecutor came with responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. The Thompson case had the potential to affect dozens of lives, and that morning's motion could affect the entire prosecution. She finally pulled into the municipal court parking lot at 9:10 a.m. As she hurried toward the building, her phone buzzed with a thank you message from her boss, noting that her quick analysis had been extremely helpful. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. At least the delay had served an important purpose. What she didn't know, as she rushed up the courthouse steps with her documentation in hand, was that her slightly tardy arrival was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose deep-rooted prejudices in the very system she had dedicated her life to serving. Judge William Barrett's courtroom awaited her, and this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. Judge William Barrett's courtroom had a reputation for strict rules and cold efficiency. At 62 years old, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with an air of authority built over 30 years on the bench. This Monday morning, he sat elevated above everyone else, his black robe pressed and perfect, watching as people filed into his courtroom for the 9 a.m. session. The municipal courtroom was already abuzz with activity. 23 sat in the wooden benches, most there for minor violations, parking tickets, traffic infractions, and small disputes. Most of the early arrivals had been white, dressed in businesslike attire, their papers organized and ready. He nodded in approval at their punctuality. "All rise." The bailiff called out at exactly 9 a.m. The routine practiced to perfection, Judge Barrett entered and called the first few cases in rapid succession. He ran his courtroom like a well-oiled machine, pride abounding. To him, tardiness equated to disrespect for the law itself. The door to the courtroom opened at 9:15 a.m. Sarah Collins came in as quietly as possible, not wanting to disturb the proceedings of the court. But Judge Barrett immediately stopped mid-sentence during another case, his eyes narrowing at the interruption, focusing on the black woman who dared enter his courtroom late. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice sharp and cold. The other case was forgotten. Sarah walked to the podium, her posture straight and professional despite the hostile reception. Judge Barrett looked down at his calendar. "You must be Sarah Collins, scheduled for 9 a.m. He emphasized the time, his tone dripping with disapproval. "Do you think your time is more valuable than the court's time, Miss Collins?" Before Sarah could explain, Judge Barrett continued, his voice growing louder with each sentence, made to make an example of her. Several people in the courtroom began to squirm uncomfortably in their seats. A white businessman had arrived 5 minutes late earlier in the day, and the judge had barely noticed. "In this courtroom, we have rules," Judge Barrett lectured, shuffling papers on his desk without looking at Sarah. "This isn't some neighborhood gathering where you can just show up whenever you please. This is a court of law." Sarah stood calmly at the podium, her hands folded in front of her. She noticed how the judge had not even glanced over at her credentials or paperwork as of yet. It was written all over his face, in the way his eyes dismissed her professional attire, by the tone with which he spoke to her like a child. The bailiff, a black man in his older age named James Wilson, watched the scene with growing concern. He had seen this pattern throughout his years, presently 15 inches this courtroom. He briefly caught Sarah's eye, his glance affording her an understanding look. "Your Honor, if I may explain," Sarah began, in a steady, professional voice. "You may not," Judge Barrett interjected. "I have heard every excuse in the book: car trouble, traffic, personal emergency. None of that matters here." The time was set for 9 a.m. He picked up his gavel, as if the mere presence of it would undermine his authority. The other people waiting for their cases watched intently. A young white woman who had arrived to the courtroom at 9:10 a.m. sat quietly, her late arrival completely ignored. A pattern was crystallizing for everyone in the courtroom, even if Judge Barrett himself seemed blind to it. "This court will not put up with such disregard for procedures," Judge Barrett continued, his face slightly reddening. His authority was questioned by nothing but Sarah's calm manner. "Perhaps a fine will remind you to respect the concept of time." Sarah stood her ground, maintaining her professional composure. She had faced prejudice before in her career, but this was different. This was a clear abuse of power happening in real time, in front of witnesses, in the very system she had sworn to serve. The tension in the courtroom grew thick. The other defendants watched with a mixture of sympathy and concern. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman who had worked with Judge Barrett for years, looked increasingly uncomfortable as she typed the proceedings into her computer. What Judge Barrett did not know, as he readied himself to pronounce his sentence, was that the next words out of his mouth would start a chain reaction that would test the limits of his power and the whole system's commitment to equal justice. The real surprise of the morning was yet to come. Judge Barrett leant forward in his high-backed leather chair, his face set sternly as he readied his sentence. Harsh morning sunlight filtering through the high windows of the courtroom cast an unflattering glow across his features, making him seem more formidable than he usually did. "Miss Collins," he declared, his voice booming off the silent courtroom walls, "this court finds you in contempt and fines you $500. He took a moment to let the figure settle. It was among the heaviest fines had doled out for lateness this year, but he didn't say so. She stood perfectly still at the podium, her mind racing to note every detail of this interaction. How the judge's eyes never quite met hers, the tone in his voice with that particular edge she had heard entirely too many times before. Years in her profession as a federal prosecutor had honed a sixth sense within her to recognize prejudice masquerading as authority. With hesitant fingers, the fine was typed into the computer system by the court clerk, Mrs. Thompson. She had been keeping the records in this courtroom for 12 years and felt uncomfortable about something with the situation that she made a separate note in her personal log. Just last week, a white male attorney came in 20 minutes late without an explanation and only received a verbal warning. Besides that, Judge Barrett added, his voice even more pompous and taking her silence as the encouragement of submission. Take this as a lesson in responsibility. He raised a piece of paper, feigning to read from it, but clearly for effect. The justice system works because there is order and respect. Without timeliness, we have anarchy. In the gallery, the other defendants watched with different reactions. A young white woman in a business suit looked at her watch, remembering how late she, too, had arrived, but without any remark from the judge. An older black man shook his head slightly. He had witnessed this scene one time too many. The bailiff, James Wilson, continued to stand professionally beside the judge's bench, but his jaw clearly tightened. He had kept count of such incidents over his 15 years of service, although he never spoke about them. Today's fine was much heavier than usual, and the timing of it all seemed particularly harsh. Sarah took a slow, deliberate breath. She had handled countless cases in federal court, prosecuted dangerous criminals, and faced down hardened defense attorneys. This situation was different. It was personal, yet it represented something much bigger than herself. She carefully pulled out her phone and made a quick note of the exact time and amount of the fine. Also, Judge Barrett added, warming up to his disciplinarian role, you'll be paying this fine before you leave the courthouse today. We wouldn't want you to be late with that either. There was a smattering of nervous laughs in the gallery until the tension in the air actually hushed them. The morning sun had moved and was now shining directly on Sarah's face as she stood at the podium. Her expression was professional, but a fire in her eyes could have given a wiser judge cause to hesitate. She had built case after case, collecting evidence, tracking down witnesses, following the evidence to its legal conclusion. Now, unwittingly, Judge Barrett was handing her the material evidence for endemic bias in his courtroom. Do you understand the fine as I have explained it? Judge Barrett asked, his tone implying that he was expecting nothing but meek acceptance. Sarah looked him right in the eye and spoke in a steady, calm but firm tone. I understand, Your Honor. The big fight had just begun, and Sarah knew this morning would be the spark that ignited a flame far larger than any dispute over a simple parking ticket. Sarah exited the courtroom, her mind full of races. She stepped outside into the cool morning air, which had a soothing effect on her. She pulled out her cell phone and added one more note. Judge Barrett, $500 fine due to lateness, discriminatory treatment to others. Sarah somehow felt that this was not the end of the story. Sarah didn't let the matter lie. She had a feeling that treading carefully in this matter would be enough, while at the same time, she knew that if she was to let Judge Barrett's behavior go unchecked, then it would continue to hurt others, people who perhaps would never have the means or even the guts to fight back. She took a deep breath and dialed a number she had used only a few times before. Hi, Gloria, it's Sarah, she said, as the other line picked up. Gloria Thompson was an esteemed civil rights attorney and an old law school friend. I need some advice regarding something that just happened in municipal court. I think this may be systemic bias. Gloria's voice came through with much concern. Tell me everything. Sarah described everything that had happened, from the moment she had stepped into the courtroom to the judge's mean words and his extremely high fine. Gloria listened intently, every now and then asking a question. This is serious, Sarah, Gloria said when Sarah finished. Judge Barrett's behavior sounds like a clear abuse of power. If you're ready to pursue this, we can start gathering more evidence. But you need to be prepared this won't be easy. Sarah nodded, though Gloria could not see her. I know, but I just can't do nothing and stand by. Not when I have the ability to do something about it. All right, Gloria said, her voice taking on a determined quality. First, we catalog everything. We want witness statements and, if we can get them, any records of a history of this behavior. I have one or two contacts who might be able to help. Relief washed over Sarah. She was not in this fight alone. "Thank you, Gloria. We'll start reaching out to people who were in the courtroom. I think the bailiff, James Wilson, might be willing to talk." "Good," Gloria said. "The more people we have willing to testify, the stronger our case will be. And Sarah, this is bigger than it is about you. You are standing up for everyone who has been mistreated by the system." Sarah hung up the phone and hardened in her resolve. She knew the road to exposing Judge Barrett's bias was going to be long and hard and possibly a career-risking action, but she also knew it was right. She couldn't let fear hold her back. The next few days were whirlwind. She contacted James Wilson, bailiff, and he confirmed having seen similar incidents involving Judge Barrett. He agreed to give a statement, although he was quite appropriately cautious about risking his job. Sarah also spoke with Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, who suggested that there might be records of Judge Barrett's differential treatment of defendants. Although Mrs. Thompson was clearly unwilling, she did promise to think about what she could do. Meanwhile, Gloria began to take care of the legal aspects, writing up a formal complaint and initiating the process of gathering evidence. She also contacted several advocacy groups, realizing that public pressure was going to be a significant factor in forcing change. Sarah went on with her daily job in the U.S. Attorney's Office, but she would never let go of that morning. Every time she stepped into courtrooms, she was reminded of the privileges that came along with her position and the responsibility to fight for justice. Not for herself, but for everyone. A week later, one afternoon, Sarah received a call from Gloria. "Sarah, I believe we do have enough to pursue a formal complaint, but I need to know if you're ready for this. Once we go public, there's no turning back." Sarah let out a deep breath as she thought about the other defendants in the courtroom that day. The young white woman who had arrived late without consequence, the gray-haired black man who shook his head in recognition of the unfairness. She considered the multitude of others who did the same without an advocate to speak up on their behalf. "I'm ready," she said with resolve. "Let's do this." Pride was now in Gloria's tone of voice. "All right, they'll file the complaint tomorrow. And Sarah, whatever happens, know you are making a difference." Sarah hung up the phone, feeling both afraid and determined. She knew the journey ahead would be quite tough, but she also knew this was a battle worth fighting. She gazed out of the window in her office, and as the Atlanta skyline unfolded before her eyes, she knew that this was just the beginning, not only her fight against Judge Barrett, but also an assertion that the word justice should better approximate reality. A few days later, Sarah and Gloria sat together in Gloria's office, reviewing the final draft of the formal complaint. It was detailed, with cited specific incidents of the behavior in question, along with testimony from both James Wilson and Mrs. Thompson. Gloria had also been able to get statements from a few other defendants present that had witnessed, firsthand, the biased actions of Judge Barrett. Taken together, their stories wove a tapestry of cause and effect that could no longer be ignored. "This is strong, Sarah," Gloria said, tapping the papers in front of her. "We've got witness statements, documented incidents, and even evidence of similar cases being handled differently by Judge Barrett. We're ready to file." Sarah took a deep breath, looking at the complaint. She knew the risks involved. Judge Barrett was well-connected, and the backlash could be great. But she also knew that if they succeeded, they would affect real change not in Judge Barrett's courtroom, but in all of the judiciary. "Let's file it," Sarah said, her voice steady. "It's bigger than him. It's about justice for all of those people being taken advantage of." Gloria nodded, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I was hoping you'd say that. They'll submit this today, and then we'll see what happens next." The complaint had been filed that morning, but by afternoon, it was already making news. The story spread to local newscasts and quickly went viral on social media. Various advocacy groups rallied around Sarah and Gloria, demanding that Judge Barrett be investigated for her behavior in the courtroom. The reaction was unanimous. There were those who shared stories of how they had been discriminated against in the justice system, thus heaping pressure on municipal court. Meanwhile, Judge Barrett said nothing. The court issued a terse statement indicating that the complaint would be reviewed, but it was clear that the increasing public scrutiny was having an effect. What had once been a bastion of unquestioned authority, the courthouse, was now under the microscope. Sarah continued her work, with her days now filled with interviews and meetings with advocacy groups. She knew the fight was far from over, but the momentum was building. One afternoon, she received a call from a local journalist who wanted to do an in-depth story on her experiences and the broader issues of bias in the judicial system. Sarah agreed, knowing full well that the more light they could shine on these injustices, the harder it would be for people to ignore them. A month later, an official notice came. Judge Barrett was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. It was a small victory, but a significant one. It meant the system was taking their claims seriously, and that change was possible. Gloria called her that evening. "We did it, Sarah. This is just the beginning, but it is a step in the right direction." Sarah smiled, her eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you, Gloria. I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," Gloria said, her voice warm, "but I'm glad you didn't have to. Now, let's keep going. There's still so much work to be done." She knew she was right, that the fight for justice wasn't even close to being finished, but for the first time in a very long time, she had some hope. They had taken on the system, and they were winning.